Welcome to Power Shift, a podcast from the New Humanitarian and the Center for Transformational Change. I'm Melissa Findira. Each episode, we bring together decision makers in aid and philanthropy and those affected by their decisions for candid conversations. This podcast asks, what's possible when two people on different points on the power spectrum try to build relationships of trust through dialogue? Here's where we're at today. The global humanitarian system is in crisis. Its biggest donors are cutting support, and this is threatening millions of people who have grown dependent on aid. But the system was already shaky. It's dominated by big international players. It sidelines grassroots groups. It doesn't listen to the people who use aid, and it hasn't fully reckoned with its colonial origins. Past reforms have stumbled, but if humanitarianism doesn't change, it will simply become irrelevant, as many have said. So, can honest, one-on-one dialogue be part of a new start, a shift in power?
If you're seeing the reality as we are seeing it, why are things not, moving? People who are usually high-ranked in bureaucratic and kind of headquarters and organizations are not usually in touch with the field.
Nadine Saba directs the Akar Network for Development. It's an NGO she created to support the needs of people in her hometown in Lebanon. She's been speaking with Michael Köhler, who has over 30 years' experience in international cooperation, aid, and foreign policy, including leading the EU's humanitarian aid arm, ECHO.
And I was surprised to see that, no, he does know a bit of the field. So it's not only the theoretical, but at the same time, so if you are understanding that, and if you are understanding that, then others in similar ranks are understanding that. And why are we still having what we're having to go through?
As ambassador and what's known as a Sherpa, Michael and Nadine are responsible for steering the Grand Bargain process from different ends of the power spectrum. The Grand Bargain is a big humanitarian reform process, and it's now nearly a decade old. But many critics say it's falling short of its goals. Some have lost hope it'll ever reach them. Michael concedes there's still more work to be done.
Objectively speaking, many of our problems simply come from the fact that we are badly organized. I wouldn't think that, for example, there is a lack of resources, financial resources, instruments, and so forth. There is an abundance of such resources. It's only that we frankly often don't combine them in an intelligent way, that we don't organize ourselves in a very good way. The fact that, we need $50 billion a year to satisfy humanitarian needs right now on the globe, yeah, that's a big number. But if you look at what we offered, for example, in the COVID crisis or in other crises over the past years, in terms of financial assistance, 50 billion worldwide, I wouldn't say it's peanuts, but it's something that can be managed. And the public budgets have the possibility.
And Nadine says the issue is merely a symptom of the world we live in.
It's how the world is functioning. It's how countries are interacting with each other. It's how nation states are interacting, and it's about an imbalance of power within the world.
Michael and Nadine sat down together 4 times over the course of 2 months. In the last episode, which you can find in the New Humanitarians podcast feed, they got to know each other and started to lay out their differing thoughts on what it would take to deliver more effective and efficient aid, which are essentially the goals of the Grand Bargain. In this second and last half of their conversations, we find out if they're able to reconcile those differences.
Is there something that you wanted to make sure that we bring forward this time?
Nothing on my end. The last time feels like a long time ago, but it's a nice memory.
Exactly. I do not remember what we talked about last time.
So Nadine, let's agree that we would contradict ourselves this time.
Hopefully not.
I just had one random question. Since we last spoke, have the two of you been in a Grand Bargain meetings together, like in the past, or no? You haven't seen each other since the last call?
No, absolutely not. In my part of the world, it's holiday time, actually.
Sure.
With everything going on, I don't think I had the time to remember what happened in the last 3 sessions.
Yes, same here. And obviously, I feel very much for Nadine, because the situation in and around Lebanon gets hotter and hotter.
Just a few weeks after this conversation, the crisis in Gaza escalated. Nadine was set to join a panel organized by the New Humanitarian in New York City on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly in September. But just days before the event, Nadine's flight was canceled. Israel had bombed Lebanon. The few available flights out of Lebanon were booked up within minutes. Thousands in the country were killed, many more were displaced. For Nadine, her predicament, even before this current crisis, highlighted a key barrier to fixing humanitarian aid.
If we look a bit towards the country states, towards member states, who are at the same time, in some situations, playing the role of the donors who are providing resources for humanitarian aid, and at the same time are also actors on the geopolitical scene. And this is where I believe this intersection between politics, human rights, aid, and crisis is where we need to rethink where we are in this world in terms of humanitarian actors, and what is the function of the humanitarian sector in this conjuncture of politics, humanitarian support, and ultimately economic interest as well. This is how the world is. This is where we are. Not all the conflicts or the crises are just nature-made. A lot of them are man-made. The Grand Bargain is a trendsetter in a sense. Some of the topics that are discussed in the Grand Bargain are later on picked up by other forums, by other organizations to build up on it. And this is one of the, I would say, strength of the Grand Bargain. But at the same time, it could be a weakness because we might not always have the executive arm to be able to ensure that whatever we're trying to push or whatever we're trying to suggest is concretely happening within the sector. So I see Michael is nodding a bit his head, but I'm not sure how much this resonates. But at one point, I understand that change is incremental, but at the same time, things are getting extremely hectic on the field and on the ground. And it feels like you're incapable of doing anything. And this is where I believe frustration grows. And we get into a vicious cycle in a sense, because we're frustrated, we're not being able to push things, and it just goes around.
Nadine, I just wanted to get a sense. So you have mentioned the frustration a few times in our last conversations and today as well, which is, understandable. I'd love you to flesh that out a little bit. What are the conversations that are happening?
Moderating their conversation is Lina Srivastava. She's the founder and director of a social enterprise called the Center for Transformational Change.
Like, when you talk about this frustration of not being able to move within the sector because of external power imbalances that are brought on by nation states or donors, what are people saying and what are they asking for?
People are not a homogeneous group. Crises are not the same. And this is where I believe the system needs to be more agile and more flexible in understanding that there is no silver bullet, that what works in Lebanon might not work in Yemen, might not work in Myanmar, might not work in Syria. I think we keep on repeating this. This is one of the very small examples that lead to frustration. The second example is if we look to Gaza, if we look to Myanmar, as you mentioned, if we look to Sudan, if we look to Yemen, do you think people believe in humanitarian aid anymore? Do you think people who are living in those cities, in those villages, in those settlements, do believe in humanity, in humanitarian aid, in the humanitarian sector? That's another example of frustration. That's another example of the imbalance of power. I mean, It might feel like I'm being too emotional, but this is the reality. This is how people are living, and this is how people are dying. And this is where the frustration is. You cannot go and tell somebody, you know what, explain to me, why are you frustrated? Well, I'm frustrated because I don't have access to clean water. I'm frustrated because I don't have access to food. I'm frustrated because I'm in displacement. Frustration is a very small word to describe that. And local organizations are coming from this context. So they feel the frustration double, because not only they're feeling it in their own flesh, in their own bodies, in their own lives, they feel it double because they believe that they have a certain responsibility. And they believe that they have believed in this sector, and the sector has failed them. So this is where the frustration even grows bigger.
I listened to you not only with great interest, but also with my own little frustration, because, every paragraph that you finished, I said, okay, now I would like to react to that. And then you said something new. And then I said, no, I have to react to that. And now there's total turmoil, so to say, in my brain, and I don't really know where to start. But one of the big challenges of humanitarian aid today is the protractedness of crisis. And, this leads to a situation where, in the cases that you mentioned, the Palestinians, the Syrian refugees, the Rohingya, and many others, for years and years and years continue in their suffering, and the only form of assistance that they get is humanitarian aid. So automatically, you start kind of using humanitarian aid as a synonymous expression for aid and for solving the problem, which humanitarian aid is in reality not being made to solve, but just to alleviate, to ease. Now, if you add to that, and there we come to the point of localization, if you add to that the traditional structures of humanitarian aid are still very much that Western donors and Western organizations help people that are not in the West, then it looks like, let's say, a benign form of foreign interference. So if you are suffering in a protracted conflict or crisis, and you see for 10 years that your situation gets from bad to worse, then you think it's perhaps this form of aid that I get and that de facto makes me survive because I get food, I get health and so forth, health assistance, but in a little doses, not enough. It is that, and it comes from the West, that basically should be totally different in order to make my life more dignified. The diversion of aid, the insufficiency of aid, sometimes the low quality of aid, sometimes the fact that humanitarian principles are not perfectly well implemented, but there may be elements of partiality and of bias, for example. Because we're all human beings and nobody of us performs perfectly. So there is kind of an overcharging of expectation, very understandably, with respect to what humanitarian aid should and could do. And I don't say that this is not justified. I think it's justified, but that we should take it as a stimulus to think first how to do humanitarian aid better, and secondly, how to implement it as part of a larger framework to address crisis, because the framework that we have is clearly no longer performing.
Well, it's good to hear that there is an acknowledgement that the framework is no longer performing. So at least we're agreeing on that. It's interesting when we as humanitarian practitioners are talking, we're a bit elitist, where we know more than what the others know, or we can do things better than what the others do, which is not always true. And I think one of the points that would allow us to recalibrate is to be a bit humble in how we perceive our role and how we deliver our mission. We need to be humble to accept that there is a limitation and that we cannot do a lot of the things that are needed to solve a crisis or to solve a conflict, and we need to go back to others and see. I would agree with the fact that what are we supposed to do as humanitarians, and the fact it's not for us to solve the conflict, it's for us to ease and to alleviate the suffering. but at the same time, what we're doing is only Band-Aid. And ultimately, it's leading to a point where there is donors fatigue, where people are bored of one crisis and need to go to somewhere else, and funding goes to somewhere else, and resources are allocated to somewhere else, and people remain in a very miserable situation. I would have loved to hear from Michael a bit his take on the duality of the donors being actors on the geopolitical scene and a lot of time decision makers on the humanitarian sector scene, because at least in some of the contexts, it's that geopolitical dimension that is hindering the delivery of aid.
I don't share that impression totally. Maybe because I'm coming from another end, so to say. If you look at it, who are the main donors of humanitarian aid and how are they organized? Then you come to the very clear understanding that for most of them, these are rather potent states and they finance humanitarian aid from their foreign affairs budget. Give you one example. When was it now? About 2 years ago, the big earthquake happened in Turkey and Syria. Of course, there was a lot of support immediately for Turkey, but 1 or 2 days later, search and rescue teams went also into Syria and in all parts of Syria. So, people and countries and states mobilized assistance, although they are at odds with the Assad government, although they have certain political positions in the civil war there or in the conflict, and that didn't hold back in any way aid for the sector. So, one can always wish for a better solution, but I think that the firewall that exists between foreign policy making in a foreign ministry and the humanitarian department works relatively well. When there's a new crisis that emerges, and when a country is very much concerned by that crisis, then of course it uses or it looks at its toolbox, and if it finds humanitarian aid in the toolbox in order to address that crisis, it will also activate humanitarian aid. Why did we have these huge increases in international humanitarian aid funding as from 2015? It was because of the crisis in Syria and because of the pouring out of so many Syrian refugees from Turkey, from Lebanon, partly from Jordan to Europe. Now, you could call this a political element, but it was a very welcome one because we got much, much more money that otherwise we would never have had for the humanitarian sector.
Well, I do have to disagree with the example of Turkey and Syria and the earthquake. I mean, we have seen on TV people in Syria trying to get the rebels with their own hands. We have been hearing from people that there was nobody to their rescue. And a lot of time, even if we had a research and rescue team who do not have access to the needed equipment, what are we doing? If they don't have access to the big vehicles who are able to remove the rebels, what is the team capable of doing in this perspective? So at least in that example, I would have to disagree on the fact that there was this, if I may say this, equality in dealing with communities and with populations. So in this perspective, again, going back to what the humanitarian aid is delivering and what the people are perceiving about humanitarian aid, I am here to speak a bit about not the technicality of humanitarian aid. I'm here to say that this is what the people are telling us. This is how people are reacting to us. For them, in different contexts, humanitarian aid is not being able to deliver. When you talk to somebody and you try to explain that there are the rules and that we need to abide by this and we need to abide by that, they look at you, I'm like, okay, we need to abide by this and that, but nobody needs to abide by what we need. So in this session, I'm not here to explain and to go into the technicalities of how humanitarian aid works. I'm here to say what the people are feeling and what the people are perceiving. The people are perceiving that we are not doing what we are supposed to be doing, because when they look at us, when we arrive to the field and when they are there with nothing in their hands, they are looking at us to be able to deliver. They are looking at us to be able to make their needs met. And in a lot of times, we cannot do it.
The kind of how should I say, the cause or the reason why we have humanitarian aid has so much changed over the past years in quantity and perhaps to a certain extent in quality. It's no longer the short-term intervention that you do after a disaster, a natural disaster, or perhaps a short war. Today, we have humanitarian aid as the main tool to manage the humanitarian consequences of a crisis, of a war, and probably 10, 15, 20 years after the war. So the sector is totally overwhelmed, first by the amount of aid that is needed, and secondly by the fact that now we're operating in a world of political consequences and political considerations. If you look at some of the major donors and analyze the figures, how much humanitarian aid were they giving, say, in 2005 and how much now, 20 years later, then you will probably see that humanitarian aid has grown exponentially and in certain cases matches almost the same country's expenditure for development aid. So big bureaucracies have been building up. And that leads to a situation, as Nadine said, basically that without any bad will or so, you have different services with different bosses, different egoisms and interests, and different political masters coming from different political parties in a coalition government and so forth. And that makes coordination extremely difficult. But if you wait for some sort of push from the inside to reform the system, this is going to be difficult because it requires a lot of leadership that has to overcome a lot of vested interests in the established services and institutions. I sometimes speak about the humanitarian industry, and then people look, in a strange way. But I think it's an industry because first you can make money. I mean, I perceived my salary when I was still in active service from that, people produce something. They produce welfare, if you so want. They produce improvement of humanitarian situations. They have interests, and there's a market out there. And in the same sense, you have a development industry and you have a peace-building industry. And where you have industries, you have corporations and you have people who have interests and you have overheads and you have the possibility to win or to lose. So every reform of that sector will have winners and losers. Now, I think what Nadine and I have been talking about for many hours now is to have the people who need the aid on the winning side. But we have to acknowledge that there are also people on the implementing side that don't want to lose. And when we go for reform, we have to do it in such a way that the case for reform is so compelling and the losses for those who have something to lose are so digestible that there's a chance to implement them, not through dictatorial means, but through the force of conviction and commitment.
Well, it is true. It is an industry. It's the reality of things. But it's my fear is that waiting for the moment where presenting it in a way, if it's a win-win situation, is not going to happen.
Nadine, you have to create that moment. It's not waiting for the moment. Huh?
Well, are we creating it?
Not yet, but by talking about it, we hopefully create more awareness. And at some point, we need to have leadership to pick up on that. The question is, who should provide that leadership? And you will have your ideas about that. I might have my ideas about that. But, it's like in certain religions, you wait for the Messiah. We don't know when the Messiah will come. But you need to work in such a way that he or she could come any moment.
I'm not that convinced. Let me put it that way, because ultimately that means we're waiting. So
active waiting.
Maybe, but still waiting. But if active waiting is just having something that's coming parachuted on people, as a lot of things have been done previously, then no. So in this mindset, when we're speaking about creating this moment and about pushing for it to happen, it needs to have a component of being people-centered. At the moment, most of our interventions, even if we want to label them and if we try to label them as people-centered, but we get lost in the technicalities and the details and the logistics. And sometimes it's difficult for us to remember that it is a people-centered. And my fear is that whenever we're thinking about any new tools or any new systems, that we open the Pandora box and we lose whatever we have gains in this perspective. And this is where a bit of my fears and pessimism comes in terms of what is the weighting in this and how to make it happen.
You both are members of the Grand Bargain. What is your opportunity, your possibility to lift up these perspectives on duality, the perspectives and the needs of people who are affected by this, who don't know about international humanitarian law or how it affects their lives? Where is this listening happening? Is it?
No, not really. Not really. I mean, the Grand Bargain was not created to be a forum for this kind of discussion. Eh? And I think there's an increasing call for it to be the kind of body, forum, I avoid the word institution because it is not an institution at all, but the kind of arena where we discuss these questions and where we discuss them, so to say, with a way to produce very concrete results. Because the Grand Bargain has a certain technical charm. When we speak about localization, when we speak about quality funding, when we speak about, for example, accountability to persons or to people, which is, I think, very close to what Nadine just mentioned, this is not meant to be philosophical. It's meant to produce commitments and perhaps sometimes also new instruments that then the signatories would commit to implementing. And this is being tracked. This is being reported about. But we have not yet, so to say, come to the founding moment where world leaders would come together and say, listen, let's be honest, the state of the world is terrible. We have conflicts and we have problems that we could not envisage 10 or 15 years ago. Our toolbox is nice, but it's incomplete. And we need to show more resolve, more commitment, but perhaps also think about some new tools in order to address that. That moment still has to come. If Grand Bargain decisions and discussions can contribute to that, contribute to creating awareness, then I'm all in favor. I'm not yet sure whether the Grand Bargain as such would be the right forum for it, but we need to be part of the gang, of course.
Nadine, how does that moment come?
When would that come?
How or when?
When is the $1 million question that I don't think anybody has an answer to. How would that moment come? I think that ultimately the humanitarian aid and the whole system needs to look further, needs to talk amongst each other, whether in terms of peace building, whether in terms of development, to avoid needing this amount of funding, because this is getting into cycles, and each couple of years we're seeing this type of cycle where geopolitical changes happen in some donor countries. Aid is firstly kind of targeted, and then for some time we try to find an equilibrium, we're trying to find a way of coping with it, and then we move ahead. But we're still not going towards the root of the problems. Yes, some of the root of the problems are too hard to solve, but some of them might have a potential issue for a solution. I believe we're not having that willingness and we're not really dealing with it. It's easier to send money for humanitarian aid than to delve into the issue at itself. It's easier to reduce the amount of aid than going back and having such a retrospective look and saying, well, we did not really do well in that period. So while I agree on the risks, on the trend, on the need to have a different perspective, I believe that this perspective should not be only linked to humanitarian aid, needs to be further approached and needs to be more elaborated to include as well, I mean, sometimes governments from the countries that we want to work in, whether local, whether national. I know that in some places you have sanctions. I know that in some places you have different political considerations, but some things need to change. How and where, it really depends on the context. Crisis in Lebanon is different than the crisis in Sudan, different than the one in Yemen, different than the one in Myanmar. So I don't have the silver bullet. I don't think any one of us has the silver bullet, but I believe that we need to be a bit more bold into having this retrospective look towards what we are doing. Are we just curing, a symptom? Are we really digging into the diagnostic of the problem, the root of the problem?
So digging a little deeper into this, there are some recurring themes, right, that have come up in your conversations over the last 3 or 4 interviews, which is, number one, there needs to be more integration from within humanitarian aid across different themes, across different subsectors. There has to be more integration with peace building, development, rights, etc. That is inherently a political theme. The other theme that's come up is this question of where power lies, right? That's why we're doing these conversations. So the first question is this idea of integration, this idea of what does humanitarian aid take control of? Who has power to decide who does that? Is that the grand bargain? Is that someone else?
But I think the grand bargain has not yet evolved to becoming the forum for discussing the future of the sector as such. It is still relatively technical. It still looks at individual instruments, where we should basically agree what we want to do with the grand bargain in the future. Do we want to end it in 26 as foreseen? Do we want to, let's say, continue it but keep it technical? Or do we want to turn it into the platform where basically the entire future of the sector, as a part of international aid, as a part of a more generic and a larger approach of going about crisis fragility, is being discussed? These are roughly the 3 options that I see at this moment in time. And I think the jury is out. The jury is out because there are pros and cons for each of the 3 approaches. But I think the discussion that we will conduct there needs to be informed exactly by the things that we're discussing here in this podcast. That is, where does humanitarian aid stand? And what does it take in order to ensure not the future of the sector, but to ensure that humanitarian aid can deliver for the benefit of the people in need in the future?
Nadine, I know you missed a little bit of that. Welcome back.
Thank you. Electricity cut. I'm sorry.
There's a power imbalance right there. So we were talking a little bit about the grand bargain itself and whether it is at the moment fit for purpose and where does it go from here?
Well, for some local and national NGOs, they do have some doubts in terms of the progress that the grand bargain had shown towards its own commitments. So some of them have been even asking, isn't it too tokenistic when we're speaking about the grand bargain? And why do we need to still participate in it when a lot of the commitments are still, we haven't even reached those goals? I do understand a bit where they're coming from. I do understand their positioning, because I believe that there was a lot of expectation around the commitments of the grand bargain. And there was a lot of, this euphoria of having this commitment, whether at the World Humanitarian Summit and afterwards. And I believe that a lot of the people who were genuinely wanting to make a change felt that they had a lot to deal with, whether in terms of structures, internal systems, processes, and things that were not mostly visible to others. But at the same time, it was also this risk aversion this unwillingness to change that had led sometimes to the bottlenecks or to the fact that things were not progressing as some of the stakeholders would have wanted to be. Now, it is still, at least, one of the few spaces where you have most of the stakeholders sitting together at the same table. And I'm here speaking about the different constituencies of the sector, local and international organizations, UN agencies, the Red Cross and the Red Crescent and the donors. And so I think that the Grand Bargain still has a lot of potential, but I'm not sure that there is the will for the Grand Bargain to live up to its potential.
The Grand Bargain is almost like the mirror in which you look every morning once you get up, you know? If there's no mirror, you don't really know what your face looks like and whether the night was tough or not, so to say. If you have a mirror, then you look into it and you start to reflect on it. And you say, well, maybe I should sleep a bit longer tomorrow, or I should perhaps live a little bit more healthy tomorrow, or I should relax, or I should look less grim. So the Grand Bargain basically reminds you of unpleasant truths. And if there was no Grand Bargain, there would be no mirror. I mean, every donor, every implementing organization, every partner, every local organization would do just, as they want to do. There would be nobody to basically remind them of how it should be. When you think about the future of the Grand Bargain, the question really is, would anything be better without the Grand Bargain? I think no. Would it be worse without the Grand Bargain? I believe yes, it would be worse, because we wouldn't have this kind of platform that reminds us of the need to get better, to reform, to open up, to share power. And then the question, if we come to the conclusion that yes, actually the Grand Bargain, although sometimes it may be a little bit nasty, so to say, is rather a force of good and it's something that helps us to go the right way, then we can discuss how to make it more efficient. And we can make it perhaps a little bit more binding in certain regards or so. We can give it more clout. That we can discuss. But I personally believe that as kind of, voluntary the Grand Bargain is, it is something that has this big advantage of bringing together everybody in the sector and being basically the only platform where reform needs are being discussed transparently, and that is a good reason to reflect on whether it is worthwhile to continue with it.
Nadine, do you see evidence of that intentionality? Like, are you hopeful that the Grand Bargain is a place that you might see some experiments in power shift?
Well, usually when I'm asked such questions, I ask the people, do you want the diplomatic answer or do you want the real answer? And most times I would say both. I mean, I am not sure. Honestly, I am not sure, because sometimes it feels, yes, there is this willingness, but in a lot of times when things get difficult, people go back to old habits. People go back and fall back in their comfort zone towards putting things as usual, towards kind of conducting business as usual, rather than having this intentional will to change, this intentional will to live up to the commitments, this intentional will to include local and national NGOs, to further, for example, the financing, to ensure that local and national NGOs are at the table, to ensure that communities are consulted, to ensure that all these difficult questions that we tend to ask ourselves in the sector, because a lot of times when we're discussing it in such a setting, yes, it's everybody or most of us agree. But when we go on practice, when we go down to the field, and when things get a bit difficult, most of us tend to go back to our comfort zone, tend to go back to what has been working for the last 10, 15 years.
Michael, same question to you.
I think your question is well intended, but if you allow me, I would slightly rephrase it. I don't think the Grand Bargain is the place where change happens. Because change has to happen where the action is. And the action is in every organization, with every signatory. So the Grand Bargain is not making the change. The Grand Bargain is like a sounding board, where if it is done well, you can create kind of a majority view of how things should be done. And you can do this by creating consensus or, in a way, peer pressure.
I do see that change is incremental, but I fear that it's getting so much incremental that it's not happening. As a local and national NGO, this is where the expectations and the reality do hurt a lot, especially that as we are speaking about refining the sector and refining our tools, crises are exacerbated and exacerbating around us. As a local and national NGO, it hurts double because you're part of the community at one, and you're part of the sector as well. And you can see where the limits are, and you can see where things could have been easier or better.
If everybody acknowledges that change is there, but it's incremental and it's basically slower in pace, then this is an excellent starting point to discuss how we can do better. If we all start from that basis of acknowledgement, I think we are on the right track already. At the same time, Nadine, with all respect, and you know the sympathy and the admiration that I have for you, but who would listen to you and to your NGO was there not the grand bargain? Because there you are being listened to, being part of the game. You can use this resonance board of the grand bargain to make your voice heard and bring in your point of view. Otherwise, you would be a very respectable NGO in Lebanon that would have much less, basically, resonance in, Stockholm, Berlin, Paris, or in New York. But if you speak at the Grand Bargain in Geneva, you are not only a respectable NGO, but you're a respectable member of the forum where change is being discussed. And therefore, I think the Grand Bargain has its benefits, despite the incremental nature of change that so far it was able to produce.
I want to interject. I cannot not interject on this, because it is exactly that, because the humanitarian sector is made that way, that I would need the grand bargain to get the recognition, where I'm doing a lot of the work on the field. So even though I do agree that it is the space, and I've said it before, that it is still the space where we are all sitting at the same table and discussing equally, but it is also because the humanitarian sector has been made for the last decades, mainly for international actors and not for local ones, that I would need to be in the grand bargain to get that recognition. Otherwise, if the sector has been made differently, if the sector has been made to onboard local and national NGOs from the beginning, it would have been a different story, no?
Yes, but now we're at risk of getting philosophical. I think we were all individuals in a long chain of other individuals and structures. Nobody of us has the privilege, or perhaps it's almost a curse, to start from scratch. We are all the children of developments before us, and the only thing that we can do is to leave this world in a better state after us, so to say. So let's agree on trying to be forces of change for the better. And then if that is our common ground, you can criticize me for everything I do, because you could come to the conclusion that the Grand Bargain or I or my colleagues get it totally wrong. But we unfortunately not God the creator. We are human beings who can be improvers. There I'm ready to learn from you. And if you give us good ideas on how we can do better in the Grand Bargain, the doors are wide open.
I mean, action speaks louder than words. That's why we're still participating at the Grand Bargain, even though I said some of the constituency is like, why are we still in that space? And for me, it's like, because it is where we need to be.
A nice final word.
I want to thank you so much, because the discussion between you is so rich, and I really want to thank you so much. We just want to know if anything's changed for you during this process of talking to each other and talking to me.
I think nothing fundamentally changed, except that I think Nadine was so eloquent that I understand things that I think I knew about in theory much more practically right now, much more vividly in a way. And I would like to thank you for that, Nadine. It was really a pleasure.
I want to thank you as well, Michael, because it's always good to hear the perspective from the others. And it has always been, I mean, you have been very respectful in disagreeing and realigning things. So thank you as well for that, and to seeing it from the perspective, not only I would say from a donor, but the perspective from somebody who is heavily involved in the reform of the sector. So thank you for that.
When we started this experiment, one of the questions we asked ourselves was, what's possible when decision makers and those affected by their decisions try to build relationships of trust? Now, the 5-hour conversation between Michael and Nadine may not have changed the world or even the sector, but it brought our guests to a bit more of an understanding of where the other is coming from, and that's a start. But what did Lina Srivastava take away from moderating their discussion? I sat down with her at the end of our recordings for a debrief.
What was really stark for me is how they think of change and reform in such different ways. And that's obviously, that part of that is positionality, right? Of where they sit on the power spectrum. But part of that is just the different ways that they approach humanitarian aid. From a local perspective, that is very much about the practical, tactical, tangible aspects of administering and delivering humanitarian aid and working with people who are receiving it, versus, sort of the framework builders, right? To a certain extent, and moving and being accountable to different people. Like, they're each accountable to very different groups, which is like one aspect that I wanted to dive deeper into that we didn't quite get to. The question of like who they feel they're accountable to as participants in the grand bargain, but also like in their sort of day jobs. It was interesting that Michael was saying that the grand bargain, that forum, is not the place to quote unquote make change. I'm not the biggest fan of reform efforts, right? As someone who believes in like wholesale transformation and systems change. But at the same time, reform it's a change effort, right? And so, and he wasn't exactly saying that, but he did start out saying, well, the premise of the question I was asking was flawed in his mind, because the grand bargain is not a place to make that kind of change. It is a place to reflect.
That's part of change.
Which is part of change, because you have to, I was trying to get back to that question of, a lot of the countries that are asking for accountability for their donor money, they have basically created that wealth off the back of the countries that are receiving aid. There's a vicious cycle here, right? And that those two frames of, who has the money, who gets to deploy the money, how they deploy the money, and who they're accountable to, goes straight back to the question of colonization and decolonization, right? Even though we're not really using that term in this conversation, right? We're talking very much just about quote unquote power shift.
I was looking back at some of the questions that we started with when we invited people to take part in this project. And one of the questions was, what is still irreconcilable, even when you do build a relationship of trust between two people on different ends of the power spectrum? And I would say that they absolutely did build a relationship of trust. There's a lot of respect between them. But one of the things that I definitely found was irreconcilable, or that they never quite seemed to be on the same page, was about at what level of power they're willing to shift things. And it seemed as if Michael was articulating one vision where the general power structure of who is, makes decisions and who has the resources and who gets to set the terms of the game is still very much set by the global north. But then you can tinker within that so that there is maybe more consultation in terms of how the global north makes its decisions. Whereas Nadine's vision is obviously more a vision of shifting power is deeper than that the sector and the world at large is organized in such a way that the only place where I can be taken seriously by people who hold power and money, and as you said, because of colonialism and imperialism, is if I show up to this space where ultimately you set the terms of the game. And they kept on speaking from two different places. Like, I really think that Nadine kept trying to make the point about how the issues in the sector have to do with geopolitics and the way that the world is organized. And Michael, who has this like very deep, intimate knowledge of how the humanitarian and development sectors work, kept speaking at a very practical level about what's possible within this sector in a way as if it's divorced from politics. That's one thing that was never quite reconciled. And probably, I think it's fair to say that these things can't be reconciled in the course of 4 hours.
That desire of people who are trying to sort of look at reform or look at the state of the health of the humanitarian sector, to keep believing that any of this is apolitical really holds back power shift. It's all political.
And it's also political for our next duo, who take on the issue of refugee rights and refugee response. Raouf Mazu is the Assistant High Commissioner for Operations at UNHCR. Hafsar Tamisuddin is a Rohingya refugee, human rights defender, and the Co-Secretary General of the Asia-Pacific Refugee Rights Network.
Still, people do not appreciate what does it like to be born as a stateless person? What does it feel like to be only get to resettle to another country 5 years ago, and you have to catch up with your degree? You have to try very hard, to be embraced and respected in those positions. People feel like you are competent. What does it feel like? And I feel it's very underrated and unappreciated.
No, but I'm listening to Hafsa, and what I think is that she has the power, because you have both the lived experience and the more institutional approach through your functions. From outside, one may look at somebody who works for UNHCR in a leadership position as a person who are in a position of power as such. But again, the ability to resolve the problem is not here in Geneva at headquarters. The ability to resolve the problem is in the various locations around the world where the problem is.
How much does Hafsar's testimony resonate with Raouf? How much will it influence his future decision-making? And who truly has the power to radically improve refugee rights? Listen to our next episode of Power Shift to find out. Power Shift is a production of the New Humanitarian and the Center for Transformational Change. This podcast is hosted by me, Melissa Fundira, and moderated by Lina Srivastava. Power Shift is produced by Lina Srivastava, Freddie Boswell, and Melissa Fundira. Our editor is Erwin Loy. Our theme song is Chill 2.0 by Barno. Sound engineering by Tevin Sudi. You can find transcripts of all podcasts on our website, thenewhumanitarian.org/podcast. And if you or anyone you know would like to participate in future Power Shift conversations, email us at podcast@thenewhumanitarian.org with the subject line Power Shift. Thank you for joining us on Power Shift.